Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. I do want to start by talking about and adding a little bit of background, a little bit of mood music, if you will. Uh, it's great to have you all here today. We're going to talk today about this is little rock, if you will. Uh, we're going to talk a little bit today about Pride Month. It's June, and we're going to talk a little bit about Pride, what that means to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you are in medical affairs, if you are in pharma, if you are actually any business at all, you're going to care about today's discussion. Our guest today, it has been a frequent guest on our podcast, on our live stream. She's been here before it became a live stream. She's a behavioral scientist at BVA Nudge Consulting. She leads the North American team. She's being very, very modest. She is, I believe, CEO, if I remember correctly. Her passion lies in marrying the worlds of psychology, public health, and behavioral economics to craft impactful behavioral change solutions. Prior to joining BVA Nudge, our guest, Suzanne Kirkendall, co-developed an industry-leading social science group at Global Marketing Network McCann Health and got her master's in public health at Columbia University. Just to be clear, again, just to toot her horn from my side, she actually is part of some version of the board of directors for Columbia. So correct me if I'm wrong, Suzanne. Our guest for today, just to be clear, Suzanne Kirkendall. Hey, Suzanne, how are you?
Hey, Darshan. Thank you. I feel very pumped up now. But yes, I am on the alumni board at the School of Public Health at Columbia. Good memory.
Which is very impressive, as you can imagine. Just to clarify for everyone, if you want to reach Suzanne, because this is kind of important, you can find her by email at Suzanne Kirkendall at nudgeconsulting.com. You can find her on Twitter, and her name's too long apparently, but Suzanne Kirky is how you get her. Or you can find her on LinkedIn, and I have sent all of those comments out. So if you look on the YouTube channel, you should be able to find all of this information. I do also want to clarify that my name is Darshan Kulkarni. This is the Darshantalks Livestream. I'm an attorney. I'm a pharmacist. I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. However, I'm not your attorney. I'm not your pharmacist. So this is neither legal advice nor clinical advice. Just to also be clear, these are considerations. They're not intended to be comprehensive and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host, the guests, our employers, or our consultants. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe, please share, please ask our guests questions. You can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks. You can go to my website, darshantalks.com. You can reach Suzanne, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, on 3 different channels, whether her LinkedIn, her Twitter, or her email. Suzanne, good to have you on.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
So, first of all, what do you think about Pride Month? How's that been going for you?
It's been going. It's June. I think it's one of those things, and we'll get into this in a little bit, where obviously a month a year for any particular group that tends to be historically marginalized is not going to solve a problem per se, but it's a really important step towards raising visibility, making people feel included, opportunity to bring things top of mind, which is always a challenge, especially in this day and age. So, it's good. It's here, I suppose. How about you?
Well, it's been a very fun, interesting comment. I've had several different guests who have really opened my mind. It's been a very, very exploratory phase. So it's been super fun to hear from other people, hear what's going on. I love the fact that you're talking about bringing voices to the marginalized. Maybe we should start at the beginning. What does that even mean? When we use the word marginalized, do we necessarily mean gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or something else? Or does that mean something broader?
Great question. So it definitely means something broader. And I know the headline for today was about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which includes all kinds of identities and, circumstances of life. So today, because of Pride Month, our plan was to focus on the sexuality, gender identity part of DEI, but it is much broader than that when we're talking about marginalized communities. When we say marginalized, we're talking about things where structurally, historically, socially have been treated as less than or otherwise unkindly, but it's not any inherent quality of any of the identities that we talk about in this case. So it's a social issue.
Now, do you think that when we think about the term marginalized, we should be thinking about innate characteristics or choices?
Ooh, say more about what choices you're imagining
Well,
here.
I'm thinking about something like, say, polyamory. I just had a discussion with someone recently, and we were talking about how they identify not only on the gender spectrum and the sexuality spectrum, but they also were polyamorous. I haven't heard about any movement about including polyamorous relationships in whether it's Pride, though it's sort of Pride allied, if you will, or in any type of serious corporate discussion. So have you, and what has that looked like?
That's a really interesting question. And I think when it comes to, who's allowed to celebrate Pride and who's included and who are we celebrating and
Pride
acknowledging?
Police tells you that, though.
I'm sorry?
The Pride Police tells you that.
There's the Pride Police, I know, right? Rainbows aren't for everyone, apparently. But yeah, no, it's interesting, right? So I would say, I would even push back and say, I don't know, polyamory and different relationship styles, are those purely choices? Are some of those kind of innate preferences and wiring and capacity for, multiple connections? I don't know. I'm not going to argue about that. I'm not an expert on that. But I think regardless if it's a choice or if it's innate, right? Like sexuality, like gender identity, like anything else in the DEI umbrella of identities, I think hopefully most people would agree that nobody should be marginalized, whether it's because they choose to do something or because of the way they are, right?
I would agree. Now here's my question. Is there a tolling or a statute of limitations on when you're allowed to identify, or is there a point at which it's too late? You're in. We count you on our team. I don't know if you remember the Dave Chappelle, and you may be a little young for this, but for my generation, there was this Dave Chappelle racial draft, and I remember that. And it was a joke. It was a comedy skit, and Dave Chappelle, who himself has become very problematic recently, he talked about how different races were giving and taking. I think one of them was everyone wanted to accept Tiger Woods because of his Asian and his Black ancestry. But then there was someone, I forget who it was, everyone wanted to give him away and no one wanted him. So I thought that was kind of funny. But my question is, can you come out as a lesbian, say, in your later on in life, and do you get to celebrate Pride, and do you get to be included and sort of be welcomed? And how does that play out in corporate responsibility and corporate policy development?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? We all come to these things in our own way, in our own time. And I think there's definitely shouldn't be a statute of limitations, even if you're not, there's the idea of being like a gold star gay. If you've only ever, acted in ways that are stereotypically gay with people you've partnered with, right? And it's a very exclusionary type of approach, right? So, and identities change over time. People have life experiences where they come to terms with things or realize things, or finally are in a position where they feel safe to be open about these things for whatever reason. And so in those cases, yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about this in the community around whether, you need to be out to be able to do it, whether you need to, disclose or behave in a certain way. If you're bisexual like I am, do you need to actually have dated someone of the opposite gender before to count, right? Or can you just identify that way because you know yourself and you can say that way, right? So it really should be, the point is inclusion, right? That's the opposite of marginalization. And so I default to the more the merrier.
Which I think is a really interesting comment, because you talk about marginalized communities, you talk about erasure, but there's a issue in the LGBTQ community of bierasure, and it's an interesting issue considering there is an issue of LGBTQ erasure. So to have the community itself exclude others or say you got to pick a side is interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is a really interesting concept, and it kind of leads to some of the things that we've listed out in our Pride Guide, which I know is being shared now or in a little bit. But kind of the idea of representativeness, of default, of in-group biases. If someone doesn't fall into your expected stereotype, whether it's your heteronormative stereotype in the case of kind of the vast majority of society, or whether it's kind of your lesbian gay stereotype, right, which is easily identifiable as in some cases, and it's clear cut for some people, then there it is, rainbow, beautiful, thank you. Then it's easier for us to kind of understand it and put it in a box. And our brains like to put things in boxes, even though that's not how the world is, right? The world is not black and white, and the world is not one way or the other. So when it comes to erasure of within the LGBTQ community, it's the same kind of things driving it on a lot of psychological levels as erasure of the LGBTQ community in broader society, right? Same kind of things going on psychologically.
So let's start by talking about this, because it's so difficult. We've talked about, we had a previous guest who talked to us about definitions, and we talked a little bit about bierasure. Have you ever heard the term compulsory heterosexuality or comphet? That's another sort of bias, if you will, that pervades society. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that plays out into inclusion and acceptance, if you will?
Yeah, so compulsory heterosexuality, or comphet, is around the idea that kind of the default assumption is that you are heterosexual and anything else is a deviation, and therefore a lot of people really internalize that and can delay them realizing things about their own identity where maybe that's not actually what works for them, right? And so that's very strongly driven by the green box, and people can see this right now up top, of like the default bias, right? We just assume that things are the way they are, which historically has been, we just assume people are straight, right? Because it's statistically larger group, but it's not everybody, and it shouldn't, there's no reason for it to be the default, right? So there's a lot of talk about the idea, especially in corporate spaces, which is part of where we're going to get to today, around should people even have to come out, right? Why is that a thing? Because that is part of the idea of heterosexuality is the way, unless you are opting out into a different way, right? Why doesn't everybody have to come out and declare, including people who are sexual? And the default is heterosexual, and the default assumption is, I don't know. People will tell you if they want to tell you, right? And we don't assume. So, and you can see the same thing in gender identity as well, which is why we start to see basic inclusion practices like putting your pronouns. For example, I have them in my Zoom name today, and any other Zoom meeting, I put my pronouns at the end of my name, because I'm not assuming that the world should say, oh, she looks this way, I'm going to assume her pronouns are she, her, right? Because there are people who can look lots of different ways, who use lots of different pronouns. And so for me, I am in that case going to be kind of representativeness bias, right? Of what people probably expect someone like with she, her pronouns to look. But I'm not going to lean into that. I'm going to say, no, default is everybody should get a chance to declare, right? So that we don't make that assumption in cases where it's incorrect and make someone uncomfortable.
Which is kind of interesting, because I feel like this generation has been more exploratory about who they are and what they're willing to express. And I feel really old as I say things like this generation, but my generation didn't really have even a vocabulary around gender identity, around sexual identity. I remember when I was 18, 19, you were trying to define the word gay. Did the word gay only include men, or did it also include women? The idea of gender identity didn't quite exist. It was more you at maximum cross-dressed, or you were straight up a transsexual, and there was nothing in between. And gender is a blend of so many things. I mean, I express in multiple ways myself. So it's all about how expression, identity all come together. So I guess that really brings us to the question of, should certain communications be saved for personal life? And I'm asking you this because we're going to now use that to catapult into corporate discussions. But the first question most people would ask is, why is this even a corporate discussion? Why can't I have things the way they were 15 years ago? Why do I need to change? Why is the world changing around me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to see how quickly this has changed, right? To your point about labels, gay, my sister identifies as gay, right? And she is a woman who dates women. And, so it doesn't have to be exclusively cis male people, right? Or trans men who identify as such. And I know, the word queer, a generation ago, my friend's parents, that was a really mean slur. Now I have lots of friends who identify as queer because it's kind of a nice, now means kind of a more flexible, more encompassing identity, right? So these things change and shift as with any other language, as with any other label. So in terms of the question of how much of yourself to bring to work, essentially, and does this need to be an office conversation, or should this all stay at home? All of the research shows on when you're looking into how to manage a team, how to have a productive company, how to have people be happy at work. When people feel comfortable and safe, they're going to be a better worker, right? So it's like a win-win. You can't lose with this, right? You want people to be happy because that's nice, and happy people are more productive for your company. So that's why this is important. Obviously, people's level of comfort with disclosing different things about various aspects of their identity, gender, sexuality, and otherwise is going to vary. So the point is to make it a safe space, a welcoming space for people to present those things. We're not outing people. We're not forcing people to do anything. But you want people to know that they are welcome here, which is a change, right? Because it used to be, don't talk about that. If you are that way, we're going to treat you differently, worse, and those sorts of things. So that's more what we're moving away from, is getting the baseline to be whatever you want to share with us is welcome, and we're happy to have it.
Which is very interesting because, again, my generation had the don't ask, don't tell policy. And that was in the army, and that was in the military. And that's sort of what corporate culture was. It was very don't ask, don't tell. We aren't gonna prosecute you for being whoever you are, but we don't want to know that because that's yucky, if you will, for lack of a better term. It's a scientific term, but yucky has been well defined. So my question then is, we're now in a space where we're saying that we need to move past that. We need to have a discussion. We need to evaluate what is best for our employees, our contractors, so that they feel safe and comfortable. To do that, you've discussed models that help address those initial questions, and we had them on the screen. And here they are again. That'll come on in a few seconds. But could you talk a little bit about what each of these means and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the reason this matters in general is kind of the implied meaning behind the whole don't ask, don't tell, right? Why shouldn't I tell you? Because there's something wrong with it, right? It's not a neutral don't tell, it's a negative don't tell. Because if it was neutral, who cares? So that's kind of what we're aiming for, is just, this is part of the norm. So some things that we've created as part of this at BVA Nudge Consulting is a bit of a pride guide to help corporations and team leaders start to move towards more allyship behaviors, right? Because being an ally is not just a mindset. You can think all the nice things you want, you can feel all the nice things you want, but it's really the behavior that comes across to others, creates the culture, helps people feel welcome on a team. So what we've got in this Pride Guide are 5 different biases that we know are really important in considering, which drive allyship behavior or not in the workplace. And then we have 5 different behaviors you can adopt. So I'll talk through those biases and their behaviors. So one of them is the pessimism bias, which you can see here, which basically is the root of why a lot of this shift towards being more inclusive of all kinds of identities in the DEI space can be tricky for people, which says that basically people are worried about messing it up. And you've probably experienced this. I've definitely experienced this in all different spaces, and people talk about this all the time. Like, why didn't you do something? I was worried I would mess it up and hurt someone's feelings or be offensive, and so I just did nothing. And so this is something where it's also driven by something called omission bias, which our brain says, if I do nothing, I am less responsible for the outcome than if I chose to do something and there was an outcome, even if the outcome is the same, which is silly, right? Because you're still making a decision either way to act or not act, but you just feel less responsible if you don't. So people don't. It feels safer, even though if you're not acting, you're not promoting any kind of allyship behavior for people. So to help get around this one, because this is kind of a fundamental starting point, it can be really helpful to do basic things like sharing success stories. So help your decision makers really deliberately focus on the positive of taking that action, taking that behavior, doing that Pride Month event, putting their pronouns in their Zoom name, whatever the action happens to be, right? So that they can start to reshift our natural tendency to focus on the negative and focus on the risk, which is what our brains do, because that's how you survive. But to shift the focus and rebalance it by looking at what are the positive things that could happen, or what are the neutral things that could happen. And you're more likely to feel comfortable and motivated to take that allyship action.
So I have two questions about this. The first question is, when you talk about pessimism bias, I actually, when I read it the first time off of this little chart, I thought you were thinking about the chances of something going wrong with the status quo, not with the new action. So is that, if you will, what's the word I'm looking for? A default bias and not a pessimism bias?
I love that. That says you're miles ahead of the game, Darshan. That you think the problem is the status quo, not the new thing, because you're right. But yeah, so this intends to be focusing on, if I change something, I'm feeling pessimistic about if I make that change, right? And we're talking about it in that frame because this is a driver for why people don't make changes to be more inclusive, which is why it's a barrier here.
So my next question is something you said earlier, and I've seen a lot of it done. And I guess I'm asking both for permission for people, but also a question for clarity, because I assume you're the one who gives that permission, but we'll kind of go from there. You talked about the importance of putting in pronouns. What if you make people put out their pronouns, wouldn't that necessarily force them to come out?
Right. So this is where it becomes, when we were talking about negative, neutral, positive, this is why it's more about aiming for the neutral, which is it's safe for you to bring as much of yourself as you're comfortable bringing here. Because that historically has not been the case. It's been, you're not safe to bring a lot of these really fundamental, important parts of yourself here. So you need to hide. So we're not talking about forced outings. We're not talking about any of that stuff, because that's definitely a thing, right? Not everybody's ready to share whatever it is with the world, and that's their prerogative. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's more about saying, okay, it's safe for you to do so. And the pronouns, right? We're focusing on these. These are not changing the world, but it's a nice, simple, easy starting point for people who are starting on this journey. The pronouns, putting it there, is an invitation and a signal to people who might be on the fence or might not sure if this is a safe environment, that this is a safe environment, right? So if you feel like you have they, them pronouns, for example, which is not the default historically, me putting she, her pronouns here says, hey, we're putting our pronouns. You don't have to be the only person on the Zoom call on the team that has your pronouns. You won't be alone in that way, right? We're declaring ourselves. We're not assuming the default is one way or the other. So you're welcome to put that out there. But yes, it's not to the point of forcing someone to out themselves in any way or other, because that's not really inclusive or helpful for anyone either.
Absolutely. Which takes you to the next question, which is, as you find yourself digging in and learning more about what's out there, do you find that as we move towards remote work, this pessimism bias, if you will, is more easily addressed because we're already in the middle of flux? And if you start incorporating and being more inclusive, it's going to be just one of the new things that happens. And therefore, companies have less risk in changing.
Yeah, potentially. I think the whole remote work and all of the changes to work that have happened as a result of COVID have led to a lot more discussion and availability and attention in general on the entire DEI space. Obviously, we've got the Black Lives Matter movement. In the last few years, we've also had the Me Too movement. So all of these things socially are coming to the fore in this climate, and accelerated very much by COVID and all of its practical flow-ons like work from home. So I think it is a moment where, when things are already changing, we're more open to it. That's very much, from a behavioral science perspective, a thing, right? As opposed to right before COVID and everything is the same as it's been forever in work, it's a lot harder to change. But when everything's up in the air, we're feeling a lot more flexible, and it's a really good opportunity to make some shifts like this.
It reminds me of the story, to a woman with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I'm going to throw something out there. If you look at at Congress and they want to pass something, and it's potentially controversial, what they'll do is they'll often throw it in with a larger bill, and the larger bill may be less controversial or be something that everyone can agree on. And then there's a component in there which some would call, I think they call it pork fat, I believe is what it's called, but essentially something that people may object to. But if you object to it, you're really objecting. It looks, and people portray it as you're objecting to the larger thing everyone else already agrees to. So it's sometimes easier to incorporate changes inside a larger omnibus bill or inside larger omnibus changes. And that's sort of what you're referring to, which I think is something companies can take this moment in time to incorporate and to advocate for.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it and that's a very big picture level, and we won't go there, but in terms of, individual behaviors, something that people will tell you, like if you're trying to get into a new going to the gym habit and you've been in one place for a really long time, a really good time to do it is if you happen to be moving house, right? When you move, that is an amazing time to reshape a ton of habits, because again, everything changed. So your ingrained ways of being are not being triggered in the same way because you're not in the same environment anymore. So I'm not saying if you want to go to the gym, move house first. I'm saying what people will say is if that's an opportunity that's in front of you anyway, like go ham, go all over, look at all of your habits in your life and say, which ones do I want to change right now? Because this is it. Things are moving anyway, so let's use this flexibility to our advantage.
That's amazing. Which takes us to the next one, which is representativeness bias. So what is that?
Yeah, so representativeness is kind of what drives a lot of stereotyping, right? And all of us are familiar with stereotypes, but essentially we think about our previous experience, whether it's with a behavior, whether it's with a group of people or whatever it is, and we use that to extrapolate to the future. So we say, well, last time it was like this, so in the future it's also going to be like this, and that's it. And we overweight that past experience. We don't give enough opportunity or thought or chance to this new opportunity or choice in the moment to say, oh, maybe it could be different in a certain way, right? And so when it comes to how we make decisions in the workplace for our team and our teammates and our companies, it can help to be aware of this and say, well, are we doing it like we always do? Are we having the same people in the room making these decisions as we always do? Do we need to relook at that to make sure we have a diverse set of decision makers, people, diverse identities and all the intersectionalities of identities that are relevant, but also just people with different perspectives, right? And you're going to get to a better decision for everyone.
So to the point you're making, so be conscious of bias and bring in other people. But isn't that, from a scientific viewpoint, if you don't like the answer, change the people who judge the answer, as opposed to something else? So I guess my question would be, if I was, say, stuck with, again, I seem to be obsessed with default bias, but if I have a default bias of I don't want to change, the solution to that, if you just change the people judging it, not look at the issue independently, wouldn't that make me as the person who enjoys the status quo, make me feel like my opinion, my voice is not being included because someone didn't like the answer? And how do you address that from an HR perspective?
So thinking about kind of resistance to greater inclusion activities and how do we get around that? Yeah, so this default or the status quo is a really strong driver of behavior for all humans. I usually say that inertia is like the number one driver. We like to keep doing what we're doing. We like to go with the flow. That's easiest for us. This is why habits are such strong drivers of what we do every day. And that's just how our brains are wired, because that's the most efficient use of energy in our organs, right? Like literally on a very biological level. So when it comes to, there's people on my team who are resisting this change, well, this is where you can start to show different techniques for persuasiveness in general, right? So you can get some social norms going. You can just show that, a lot of people do think this, so we're going to do it, and that can help be persuasive. You can think about making the benefits personalized and relevant to the audience you're trying to persuade, right? So maybe you have an executive, hopefully not, it's 2022, but maybe you have an executive who's like not down with the rainbow party in June or something. So you tell them, you don't talk to them about necessarily things that they aren't motivated by, which might be, this is a nice thing to do. Again, worst case scenario straw man here, but you talk to them instead about the dollar signs that are associated big picture with having diverse, happy teams, because there is a lot of research that can link those things together, right? So it becomes also know your audience, knows what's motivating to them, what they're going to connect with. And this is just a general persuasiveness principle for how do you get people on board.
I love that principle. However, to me, it risks what I've heard of as the term pink washing, which is, I want to appeal to women, let's just paint everything pink. And then therefore women will feel included, and now I can keep making money. If you go down this path, is it a slippery slope to sort of shortchanging the larger movement? Or is it one step at a time, fight the battles you can win for now, and you can always fight new battles later?
Yeah, so in terms of the idea of, okay, we have someone in charge who was not into it, presumably because they're probably not part of the marginalized community, so they don't really feel the pain, so they don't connect with it personally. So then you say, okay, well, we've convinced them we've dragged them kicking and screaming into doing something with all our persuasiveness techniques in our toolkit, but they're not really going for it properly and making the changes. So yeah, obviously that's not a good thing, right? And this is why we talked about allyship as a behavior. So the behaviors matter the most, but mindset can drive behavior, but it's not a prerequisite. And at the end of the day, if you're doing things like treating everyone equally, does it really matter how you feel? I don't know. But also, this is why it's so important to have diverse decision makers in the first place, right? Because then they are going to be the people who are going to make the decisions that are appropriate for the group, right? There's a big principle in public health and research in a lot of different spaces called nothing about me without me, which says if there's a policy that you're making for a certain group or any kind of procedure, any kind of anything, people from that group should be part of that decision-making and implementation process. So that A, you're going to get the uptake you want to see because you've got the buy-in already, and B, more importantly, so that what you make in the first place is appropriate, inclusive, and effective.
I love that. That's a really good line. Nothing about me without me. And it sort of comes into this whole movement in pharma around patient centricity and around including patients in the decision-making process. A lot of, and I'm sort of tying it into these other movements because it's interesting for me to sort of contextualize. I've spoken to a lot of doctors and a lot of healthcare providers who go, why am I including patients in this? They don't understand what we're doing. We know best because we understand the disease state. We understand the drugs. I shouldn't have to include patients who literally don't understand the nuance. That's why they have us. And your answer to that is, yeah, but they're the ones who have to live with the consequences. And that's why they need to be included. But do you ever worry that certain voices may tone down good intentions because of sheer lack of knowledge?
Can you give an example of what you're thinking about?
I'm kind of making this up, but let's say we were talking about patients, and we were talking about whether a certain drug should be approved. In that scenario, and would it be an appropriate question to go, well, this is a very complex biosimilar, and these are all the studies done on it. We shouldn't get patients on the approval panel because they can talk about their disease state, but they can't talk about if these studies are good or bad. And I'm trying to tie that into something like this, where can someone come out and say, oh, we want to have more LGBTQ individuals on the board, But since we don't have any LGBTQ individuals on the board, we don't need to include LGBTQ individuals in people who are choosing the board because we don't have that problem anyways. So it's sort of like a circuitous problem that's coming around. There's no one in the group, therefore we can't include anyone in the group to decide who should be in the group.
Yes. Well, historically, that's how it's worked, right? If there's nobody
Right.
in the group, then they've been kicked out. But that's what being an ally is, right? You don't have to be part of the LGBTQIA plus community to be an ally and to do things like say, hey, we're making policies about parental leave or about, bathroom usage or whatever it is, but we only have people who are saying they identify as heterosexual and cis. So we should say, wait a minute, we're trying to be allies. Allies say it's not about me, it's about the people this is for, therefore they should be leading the conversation or invited at the very least. So that's where, the bridge happens. And that's kind of an important part of allyship is saying, wait, we should be using our privilege of being currently considered, the default compulsive whatever setting and say, hey, I'm going to use this social privilege, social power, and amplify someone else's voice who is part of the currently marginalized community so that we can work towards more equality.
Which goes to exactly the conversation that the next bias point, which is in-group bias. Mm-hmm. In that in-group bias, as we see here, favors those who we see as similar. So if you see someone as dissimilar, you don't include them, and therefore they're not in the decision-making process. So how do you see this played out often in the LGBTQ inclusion process?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, in-group bias is something that is so kind of primitive in our brains, right? Because again, a lot of the ways that our decision-making becomes biased and all the ones that we're talking about are our brains evolved to be very survival-oriented. And so it was, as a social animal who cannot survive on our own, being part of a group, a tight-knit group, was really important. If you weren't, you're going to die. So this is why it's so important. And this is why social situations can be so triggering for people, because it's really triggering the survival part of your brain, right? So when it comes to in-group bias, this is something that's an evolved bias that we kind of all have the tendency towards, but it certainly doesn't mean this is how everybody makes decisions all the time or that it's such a hard thing to fight, but it's something that is a tendency that we have in the back of our minds. So you need to be aware and keep your world more diverse. So this could be as simple as, who are you following on social media? Do you I make an effort to follow trans activists and LGBTQIA other activists and, people from all different parts of the world and all walks of life and all different intersectional identities, because I don't want my world to become too small. And so this is one easy, simple thing that you can do to keep those perspectives top of mind, in front of your face, learn something, humanize people who are not part of groups that you identify with, because humanization is best done through individual one-on-one contact or understanding someone's story. And that's a really important way to connect with other people.
Which is why I think it's kind of interesting, the solution you talk about, which is highlight the similarity. So you pointed out that you look at trans activists and you look at LGBTQ activists and people from all over the world. How difficult is it for you to find the similarities? Do you find the customs to be different enough that you don't identify? And is that becoming problematic when you're expecting others in corporate settings to include these different voices, if you will?
It's pretty amazing how quickly, when someone does have kind of a one-to-one connection or shares an individual story, how quickly that can shift from seeing this person as some other to relating, right? Because as humans, we have way more in common than we have different. I know there's a huge range of diversity of all kinds of worlds, and it's beautiful. And humanity is a very strong common thread with a lot of common activities, behaviors, themes, needs, right? So when it comes to that sort of thing, sure, maybe at first something's unfamiliar, but have you ever had a food that you'd never had before and thought you wouldn't like, and then you really like it, and now it's something you have all the time? Probably. Yeah. Everybody's had that experience. So just because it's not familiar doesn't mean it's not something you're going to like or eventually come to see as familiar. our brains are built to learn and to take in new information and to adjust eventually. It takes time sometimes, but this is something that is really important and easier to do than people think. And once it starts, it kind of builds upon itself and becomes a habit and a way of thinking as well, kind of a growth mindset of sorts.
I love that. Which takes us to apparently my favorite bias, which is default bias.
Yes, so, we're diving in here.
So could you talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so default bias, like I said, is the one where it's the status quo is the most powerful, the inertia is most powerful. And as we've talked about, heteronormativity is kind of the current default setting that people assume. So this historically has made it very much put the pressure on people who are not part of that majority, that norm, to go to the effort of outing themselves and explaining, and everything falls on their shoulders, right? And they have to really put themselves out there just to exist the way that they are, which is not really fair, right? Because the heterosexual people get to just be, which is really how everybody should get to be, right? Just show up and exist. So, one simple thing that we've been talking about is things like making sure everybody's in default uses their pronouns, introduces themselves that way, use gender neutral language when you're talking to groups. So instead of things like ladies and gentlemen, say hello everyone, hello friends, hello team, hello family, whatever, right? And just not making the assumption of heteronormativity.
Now, what is your opinion as a leader, as a someone who's steeped in corporate culture, to maybe that's a bit strong, but I guess the use of neopronouns like Z and Zer, and is there a role for that in corporate life, or is that the next step, or is that now is not the moment for it?
Interesting question. I would say, as someone who doesn't use those pronouns, my opinion doesn't matter terribly much, right? Would be most of my answer. My blanket answer, which has been most of my answers so far, is, we should be inclusive, right? But yeah, it's going to be very much one of those things where that's not one of my identities, so my opinion doesn't matter a whole lot.
Fair enough. Takes us to the last one. Empathy gap bias. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so empathy gap bias is all around how our current mental and emotional state really impacts our decisions that we make, and we don't kind of understand right in the moment how influential our feelings are on our decision making. We all like to think we're a lot more rational than we really are, but also it makes it really hard for us to connect with our future self, who's going to be dealing with the outcomes of this decision. We are terrible at connecting with our future selves and understanding how we'll feel about something in the future. Even if we think we know, we're usually pretty wrong. So this is one of those things where you really need to take a beat and identify the things outside of yourself that are going to be influencing your decision. So this becomes really important at more of a structural process, organizational level, because this is where putting together policies and processes is a really important part of being a good, inclusive environment for a team or for a business. Because every individual is going to come at this differently. They're going to come at it differently, even if they're the most ally person in the world. Not everybody is not at 100% all day, every day. We have tons of things in our mind, tons of things that influence our decision making, besides just being an LGBTQIA+ ally. So this is where processes become important. And this is indirectly leaning on default as a good thing, right? When we make the default, this is how we do things here. The way that we do things here, we have already set it up to be inclusive, whether that's through your hiring practices and the way that you go about promoting people, the way that you go about choosing compensation. Making those all standardized with different processes and policies is another good way at more of a higher level rather than individual level to start to be a really inclusive workplace. And I would say, actually, without that level of creating processes, creating ways of working at an organizational level, you're not actually being a place that's going to be inclusive long term. If you're just relying on individuals being nice, essentially, that's not really enough. It's great. It's a great start. We need that too. But you also, to really back it up and to institutionalize it, you need those processes and policies in place as well.
And I think it comes down to not being tied to where you are right now, which is that default bias that I keep coming back to. And sometimes that requires someone identifying those for you, a third voice, an external view. And that's apparently where you can come in.
Yes, exactly. So something that we do at BVA Nudge Consulting is a lot of work around DEI and how do you set up these processes, these policies, these systems, these ways of communicating, how to incentivize people. All of these sorts of things can help to create a more inclusive environment, both for the LGBTQIA+ community and for all kinds of other marginalized identities as well, so that we can all benefit and be happier and more productive at work and in the rest of our lives.
So that really takes us to the last question, which is, as we start going through this process, as we start talking to people, what people are going to start realizing that they don't know certain answers? How can they reach you to find out more?
Yeah, I would love to talk more about this with anybody who's interested or has questions. So you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Suzanne Kirkendall. You can find me on Twitter. I'm new to Twitter, so you can be one of my first few followers, but I post prolifically at Suzanne Kirky, or you can always email me, suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeconsulting.com.
So thank you so much for coming on. One last thing, any parting words?
I would say just thank you again for having me on. I'm so happy that you suggested this topic. I think this is really important for us to talk about, and part of us talking about this in this sort of setting is continuing to normalize it and talking about it from all the angles and making it actionable. So I'm really pleased and happy that we were able to have this conversation today.
Thank you for coming on. Thank you for having the conversation, and thank you for teaching us so much. I mean, I didn't realize it would be so complicated, so I appreciate you doing a lot of the mental heavy lifting, if you will.
Happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you.